By early 1790, the settlement at Sydney Cove was balancing on a thin edge. Hunger, uncertainty, and the slow, tense work of learning how to live beside peoples whose land had been taken without consent. Governor Arthur Phillip believed the colony's survival depended on contact, language, and restraint, even after months of mistrust, reprisals, and fear. Around the harbour, meetings could be calm one day and dangerous the next, because every gesture carried memories. In that world, Manly Cove in the northern harbour was not just a beach. It was a place where large gatherings could form, where visitors were visible long before they landed, and where etiquette mattered. Phillip went there seeking an encounter that might steady relations after earlier shocks, including violent incidents and the upheaval of disease. He did not go as a tourist. He went as the colony's centre of authority, knowing his body represented policy. Bennelong, known to the British as a man who moved between worlds, was tied to this visit in complex ways. To the colonists, he was proof that communication was possible. To many Aboriginal people, he was a figure shaped by coercion and survival. His presence could ease entry into conversation, yet it could also raise expectations and tensions. When Phillip approached a shore crowded with people, the scene carried the weight of performance. Who speaks? Who stands where? Who is owed what? Accounts describe a moment of apparent acceptance, then a sudden turn. In the midst of the gathering, a man identified in later retellings as Willemering, also rendered as Willemering, hurled a spear that struck Phillip. The action was immediate and public, not the hidden strike of an ambush. It was a statement made in full view, in a place where eyes mattered. Whatever the personal motive, the political meaning was unavoidable. The governor could be wounded like any other man. For the colonists on the beach and in the boats, the wound triggered the reflex of retaliation. A flash of panic ran through the small party. Weapons were raised. The moment could have cascaded into a slaughter because firearms changed the scale of violence in an instant. Yet what makes this episode stand out in the record is that Phillip, despite pain and shock, is consistently described as restraining his men, insisting that they should not take revenge on the crowd. Even with restraint, the scene did not freeze. A brief, chaotic exchange followed. Shouted orders, movement backward toward the water, and Aboriginal men throwing spears as the visitors pulled away. The colonists tried to protect the governor and cover their retreat. Some accounts note that shots were fired during the withdrawal, not as a planned volley, but as a shield to break pursuit and create space to embark. In such seconds, intention and outcome blur. The geography of the cove shaped everything. Sand, rock, and shallow water limit how quickly wounded leadership can be moved. Boats must be brought close, yet not so close that they can be seized. Men have to carry a body while also watching the crowd. Phillip's party did what frontier parties often do: compress around the wounded, turn faces outward, and move step by step until flotation becomes escape. The harbour that had seemed like a bridge became a barrier again. Phillip survived, and his survival mattered as much as the spear itself. A dead governor would have invited harsh vengeance, and perhaps a new policy of open war. A living governor could still choose restraint, and the record stresses that he did. In the days that followed, the colony watched to see whether his wound would harden attitudes or whether his earlier strategy would hold. For many colonists, the incident confirmed fear. For Aboriginal communities, it confirmed power to strike back. Documentary history has to sit with uncertainty. we cannot fully recover Willemering's reasons from the colonial record, because the written accounts come mainly from the side that carried pens and later printed narratives. What we can say is that the spear landed in a context of dispossession, earlier kidnappings, contested rules of approach, and the deep pressure of invasion. The act becomes a lens, not a random burst of cruelty, but a moment where sovereignty, anger, and warning could be expressed in one motion. This is why the Manly Cove skirmish endures. It is not a large battle measured in body counts. It is a compact scene where the future pivots on a single decision: retaliate or withdraw. Phillip's wound became a symbol of vulnerability, but also of policy tested under stress. In the next part, we follow the lead-up more closely. What pushed Phillip toward this meeting, how earlier contact shaped the etiquette of the shore, and why a gathering could turn in a heartbeat. To understand why Arthur Phillip stepped onto the sand at Manly Cove, you have to return to the settlement's first hard seasons at Sydney Cove, when rations were thin, confidence was thinner, and every trip beyond the palisade felt like a wager with hunger and fear. In that world, the south shore and the north shore of the harbour were not scenery. They were contested space, watched from trees, beaches, and ridgelines. Every policy choice carried a cost. Avoid contact and invite more suspicion and raids. Press contact and risk a fight you cannot control. Retreat behind fences and slowly lose the harbour to silence. Phillip tried to steer a middle course: controlled meetings, careful gestures, and a steady push to learn language and custom. Yet the colony also used coercion, seizing people to force communication when patience ran out. That contradiction poisoned trust. Bennelong stands at the centre of that contradiction. To the British, he became the most visible proof that conversation was possible. To Aboriginal groups, he was also a man shaped by capture, pressure, and survival. When he moved between camps, he carried information, but he also carried risk, because any gathering involving him could be read as negotiation, provocation, or betrayal. A mediator can open a door, and the same mediator can sharpen anger simply by appearing. Manly Cove in the northern harbour was a place where a crowd could assemble openly, where visitors could be seen early, and where rules of approach mattered. A large gathering on the beach was not a casual picnic. It was a public theatre of authority. Who stands closest? Who speaks first? Who is allowed to advance? And who must keep distance? These are decisions that announce power. Phillip's presence as governor turned every movement into a political signal, whether he intended it or not. Colonial accounts stress the imbalance. A small party of Europeans facing many Aboriginal men on a shore. In such a moment, calm confidence can look like disrespect, and restraint can look like weakness. Phillip's body was the colony's policy made flesh. If he could walk up, speak, and withdraw safely, the settlement gained room to breathe. If he could be struck and driven off, the message would spread around the harbour faster than any official proclamation. The spear thrown by a man recorded as Willemering, also spelled Willemering, landed inside that theatre. Documentary history has to be careful with names, because spellings shift and later retellings can harden uncertain identifications. But the pattern matters. The act is attributed to a specific person, and that turns the incident into a focused story rather than a faceless clash. It was a strike in full view, not a hidden ambush. The encounter, in the common outline, began with gestures that looked like acceptance. That is exactly the kind of opening that can tempt a visitor to step closer than safety allows. Then the spear flew, and the governor fell wounded. The timing is crucial. It happened amid a crowd, at a moment of exposure, when a single step backward could become panic, and a single shot could become massacre. The beach offered little cover, only distance. Once Phillip was hit, the colony's policy was tested in seconds. Armed escorts felt the instinct for retaliation, and firearms could have turned instinct into catastrophe. Yet multiple accounts credit Phillip with ordering restraint, telling his men not to fire indiscriminately into the gathering. If he gave that order, it was not softness, it was calculation. A volley into a crowd would have guaranteed a wider war at the very time the settlement was least able to sustain it. Restraint did not mean stillness. A brief scramble followed, shouted commands, men closing around the wounded governor, and a hard retreat toward the boats. Spears were thrown as the party withdrew, and some reports say shots were fired to cover the embarkation, to break pursuit and buy space. In that blur, both sides read the other through fear. One side seeing a trap, the other seeing invaders willing to kill when pressed. Phillip survived, and survival shaped interpretation. A dead governor might have unleashed sweeping punitive violence across the harbour. A living governor could still insist on measured response, even as colonists grew more anxious and more eager to treat every gathering as danger. The incident took place on the 7th of September in the year 1790, and it became a lesson in frontier politics. In the next part, we trace the aftermath, how the colony reacted, and how Bennelong's position shifted under the new pressure. After the boats pushed off from Manly Cove, the first priority was simple: keep the governor alive long enough to reach medical help at Sydney Cove. The spear wound was serious but not immediately fatal, and the men around Phillip understood that panic could kill him faster than blood loss. They steadied his breathing, kept him still, and forced the party into disciplined silence while the harbour widened behind them. Back at the settlement, the injury turned into an instant political crisis. Phillip was not only a patient, he was the colony's authority, and rumours about his condition spread faster than any official notice. Officers worried about morale, settlers worried about revenge. And everyone understood that the next few days would signal whether the government ruled by restraint or by fear. A wounded governor could become an excuse to abandon moderation. Phillip's response, as it appears in surviving accounts, tried to prevent exactly that. He repeated the message that his men should not launch immediate retaliation against the Aboriginal group at Manly, and that indiscriminate punishment would only deepen conflict around the harbour. This was not idealism, it was strategy under scarcity. The settlement could not afford a broad war while still struggling to feed itself and stabilize basic order. Even so, the incident hardened emotions inside the camp. Many colonists had already seen smoke from raids and heard stories of spears at the edges of farms. Now they had a wound on the governor's body to point to. Guard routines tightened, armed parties moved more cautiously, and every meeting with Aboriginal people became charged with suspicion. In the language of frontier communities, a single dramatic injury can outweigh months of quiet contact. Bennelong's position grew more complicated. To British officers, he remained valuable as a guide to language and protocol, yet the spear at Manly showed that contact did not equal control. To Aboriginal communities, Bennelong's closeness to the British could be interpreted in multiple ways at once: as diplomacy, as survival, as coercion, or as compromise. After Manly, any role he played carried heavier risks, because both sides could blame him for outcomes he did not command. Colonial narratives also began shaping the incident into a lesson. Some accounts emphasize Phillip's courage and restraint, presenting him as a leader who refused to let anger dictate policy even while wounded. Other retellings highlight the danger of gatherings and the unreliability of apparent friendliness. Documentary history has to note that these narratives were not neutral. They served arguments inside the settlement about how to govern, patrol, and punish. On the Aboriginal side, the written record is thinner because it is filtered through colonial observation and later interpretation. Still, the meaning of the spear is not hard to frame in context. The British were occupying land, disrupting food sources, and asserting new rules without consent. A public strike at the governor could function as warning, retribution, or an act of sovereignty performed before witnesses. The point was visibility, not secrecy. The immediate consequence was a tense pause rather than a declared campaign. People watched for signs of escalation. Would the British hunt for the spearmen? Would they fire into gatherings? Would they seize more hostages? Would they punish the wrong group? Would they interpret silence as guilt? Phillip's survival created space for restraint. But it also created a fragile situation in which one frightened patrol could trigger a cycle of reprisals across multiple coves and tracks. In practical terms, the settlement returned to the same dilemma it had before Manly, only sharper. If officers forbade contact, they lost intelligence and any chance of negotiated boundaries. If they pursued contact, they risked another sudden attack on a shore or a path. The policy Phillip had tried to build depended on time and trust, and Manly proved how quickly time can be erased and how easily trust can shatter in a single minute. This is why the Manly Cove skirmish matters beyond the wound itself. It exposes the frontier mechanism, gatherings as political stages, violence as communication, and leadership as a target that carries symbolic weight. In the next part, we track how the colony's wider security posture evolved after the 7th of September in the year 1790, and how subsequent contacts were shaped by fear, memory, and competing demands for justice. In the weeks after the 7th of September, in the year 1790, the settlement tried to turn a shock into a rule: do not let one wound dictate a permanent war, but do not pretend the harbour was safe. Phillip's order of restraint became a test inside his own camp, because frightened men prefer simple answers. Patrols tightened, sentries watched harder, and officers argued over whether firmness meant dialogue or punishment. The practical changes were visible on the water and on shore. Small boats moved with greater caution, landing parties stayed closer together, and weapons came out earlier in tense moments. Yet these adjustments also carried a cost. The more the British acted like an army in hostile territory, the more they confirmed that the territory was hostile. Every musket held at the ready communicated suspicion, and suspicion returned made the next meeting more brittle. Phillip's political problem was that he needed two things at once. He needed deterrence, so that Aboriginal groups understood the settlement could defend itself, but he also needed a channel of communication that kept misunderstandings from turning into bloodshed. He could not build a stable frontier by fear alone, because fear pushes both sides toward preemptive strikes. At the same time, he could not rely on goodwill that had already been injured by coercion and hunger. This is where Bennelong's role mattered, and also where it became more dangerous. The British continued to view him as a translator of custom and language, but the incident at Manly showed that one intermediary does not control a crowd and does not guarantee safety. Bennelong could help frame intentions and reduce insult, yet his presence could also be read as British manipulation. Each time he appeared, he carried the weight of earlier capture, and every grievance could attach to him. Within the settlement, voices that demanded retaliation did not disappear. Some colonists wanted a demonstration that would teach a lesson, because they believed only pain could prevent future spears. Phillip had to keep discipline over men who were tired, hungry, and armed. Documentary sources often praise his restraint, but restraint is not simply a moral choice. It is an administrative act enforced through orders, punishments, and control over who goes out with guns and what they are allowed to do. On the Aboriginal side, the spear at Manly could function as proof that British leadership was not untouchable. That mattered in a world where power is measured by visible outcomes. If the governor could be struck and forced to withdraw, then the British were not gods, and their rules were not inevitable. At the same time, Aboriginal communities also had to consider the danger of firearms and organized reprisals. A message can be sent, but the reply might be devastating. So the harbour entered a phase of cautious, uneven contact. Encounters could still happen, but they were shaped by memory. The British remembered the spear and the scramble to the boats. Aboriginal groups remembered kidnappings, land loss, and gunfire. When people carry different memories into the same space, a gesture of approach can be interpreted as greeting by one side and threat by the other. That gap in interpretation is where frontier violence grows. Phillip's recovery also influenced the colony's image of itself. A governor who survives a spear and insists on restraint can be turned into a symbol of civilized governance, especially in later retellings. But the documentary lens has to notice the tension between image and reality. The settlement still expanded, still consumed resources, and still demanded space. Restraint in a single crisis did not undo dispossession. It only shaped how quickly the next crisis would arrive. In administrative terms, the Manly incident pushed the colony to think more carefully about when to land, how to approach gatherings, and how to avoid being drawn into a crowd without clear permission. It also pushed them to treat information as a weapon. Who had been seen where, which groups were present, who spoke, and what signs suggested danger. Yet the more the British tried to map and categorize people, the more they risked turning complex relationships into rigid enemy lists. By the time the immediate panic faded, the skirmish at Manly Cove had become a reference point for both sides. For colonists, a warning that contact could turn in a heartbeat. For Aboriginal groups, evidence that resistance could be public and effective. Part 5 will bring these threads together, showing how this single episode fits the larger pattern of early Sydney. Negotiation under coercion, violence as communication, and the fragile space where one leader's restraint can delay escalation but cannot remove the causes of conflict. The skirmish at Manly Cove endures because it compresses the early Sydney frontier into a single, legible chain of events. Approach, exposure, sudden violence, and a retreat shaped by unequal weapons. It was not a set-piece battle with ranks and drums. It was a shoreline meeting where seconds mattered, and where one wound could have triggered a broader war. Documentary history treats it as a diagnostic moment, not a legend. On the 7th of September in the year 1790, Governor Arthur Phillip stepped into a public space that carried its own law. A large Aboriginal gathering on the beach was not neutral scenery. It was a stage where authority could be granted, denied, or punished in full view. The governor's body represented the colony's policy and expansion. In such a setting, a single act could speak louder than months of cautious contact and fragile conversation. When the spear was thrown, attributed in colonial reporting to Willemering, also written as Willemering, the meaning went beyond injury. For the settlement, it was proof of vulnerability. The administrative centre could bleed, and British authority could be forced to withdraw. For Aboriginal communities, it could function as warning, retribution, or assertion of sovereignty, performed openly before witnesses. It was not hidden sabotage. It was a message delivered in public. The immediate danger was escalation. Armed escorts around Phillip had the instinct to retaliate, and firearms could have turned panic into massacre within moments. What makes this episode distinct in the record is the repeated claim that Phillip restrained his men, insisting they should not fire into the crowd. If he issued that order, it was strategic as much as moral. The starving settlement could not control a harbour-wide war born from indiscriminate revenge. Restraint, however, did not erase chaos. A short scramble followed, shouted commands, men closing around the wounded governor, spears thrown toward the retreating party, and an urgent push toward boats. Some accounts describe gunfire as cover for embarkation, meant to create space and break pursuit. Even defensive shots can harden memories and deepen hostility. In frontier encounters, intention is one thing. What the other side hears and remembers is another. Bennelong's shadow sits over this moment. The British treated him as proof that communication could work, yet his own story was shaped by coercion and survival, and he could not control a crowd or remove grievances produced by invasion. His presence could open a door, while simultaneously sharpening anger. After Manly, his position became more dangerous. Too close to the British for some, too connected to Aboriginal networks for others, and blamed by both for outcomes he did not command. In the settlement, the spear wound reshaped fear into policy pressure. Many colonists read the incident as confirmation that gatherings were traps and that firmness meant punishment. Patrols tightened, landings became more cautious, and weapons appeared earlier in tense moments. Yet these measures also broadcast suspicion, and suspicion invites preemptive violence on both sides. The colony needed intelligence and dialogue, but it also moved like an army in contested territory, reinforcing the very danger it feared. Documentary history must also keep the asymmetry of sources in view. Most surviving narratives come from the colonists who wrote journals and later produced summaries, so Aboriginal motives are filtered through observation and interpretation. Still, the context is not mysterious. The British presence meant land loss, disrupted food sources, introduced disease, and imposed rules without consent. In that context, a public strike at the governor can be read as a deliberate political act, not a senseless burst of cruelty. Manly Cove shows how frontier conflict begins without declarations. It begins with contested meetings, mismatched expectations, and sudden violence that forces decisions under stress. It shows how leadership becomes a symbolic target, and how symbolic wounds travel fast through small communities, magnifying fear. It also shows that choices still exist inside coercive structures. Phillip's restraint likely reduced immediate killing, even though it could not remove the causes that made violence likely. The lasting significance of Manly is therefore double. It is a warning about the limits of contact when it is built alongside coercion. And it is evidence that escalation was not inevitable in every instant. One order can delay catastrophe, yet delay is not resolution. The episode leaves us with the core frontier truth. When two worlds do not share the same law of approach, violence becomes a language, and every meeting on the shore carries the memory of the last spear.